Good evening. It's good to see everyone here this afternoon. First off, I want to commend the members of the Wisconsin State Assembly, Republican and Democrat alike. I certainly appreciate the fact that they're in the Assembly chambers I was once honored to serve in and represent the people of Wauwatosa. They're in debating the bill. As I understand, it's, if not the longest, one of the longest continuous debates they've had on a piece of legislation. I think that's appropriate. I think that's a good thing. I commend, in particular, the Assembly Democrats because they're doing, I think, ultimately what the people of Wisconsin elected them to do, and that is having a debate on this measure, a debate on this piece of legislation. And I think that's what the people of the state of Wisconsin expect us to do. Earlier today, I had the chance, as I often do, reach out to different people from across the state, and I contacted someone who'd written me and talked to a small business owner from central Wisconsin. It was kind of an interesting letter. That's why I wanted to make sure I reached out and talked to him. He mentioned how when this first started, as a small business person, as someone who spent his life working in the private sector, in business, how he understood exactly what I was going through. He said that, to balance a budget, you're absolutely right. You've got to ask a little bit more when it comes to the pension and health care costs. Those are cost drivers, certainly for a guy like him in the private sector. And he said it made a lot of sense. He said it still makes a lot of sense. But as we talked for a while longer, he said, but I got a question for you. As I go around my community, there's a lot of passion here. There's a lot of intensity. And I'd like to just get back to normal because it's a concern to me, as I think it is a concern to citizens all across the state of Wisconsin. He said, I'm going to ask you a question that I'm sure other people have asked you before, but I'm going to ask it again. Why not take the 5 and 12% and just declare victory? I said, that's a legitimate question. But I'm going to tell you all the answer I told him, and I tell anybody else who asks me this. I'm overall an optimistic kind of guy. Those of you who followed me in the past when I was the county executive in Milwaukee know I like to see the silver lining in just about everything. So I like to be an optimist. I look for the good in people. I'm not normally a cynic. But I got to tell you, if you look at what has happened at the local level over the past 2 weeks since we've introduced this measure, it tells you exactly what's going to happen if we were somehow to say, well, we'll just take the 5 and the 12. Actions speak louder than words. Over the past few weeks, we've seen in school districts, we've seen in cities, we've seen in technical schools, we've seen in counties a rush to ram through employee contracts that have not a 5 and a 12% contribution. In fact, in the contracts I've seen, they have no contribution when it comes, no additional contribution when it comes to health care or retirement costs for government employees. In fact, in some cases, they actually are ramming through contracts that have an increase in the salary. On top of the fact that they're not asking for any more when it comes to a pension or health care contribution, some of these contracts that are being rushed through in communities all across the state in light of our measure are literally trying to raise the salaries under these contracts. A pay increase. Now, I don't know, that just was remarkable to me. I got to think it's remarkable to the people of the state. A pay increase at a time when all of us, I think, fundamentally know that Wisconsin faces a $3.6 billion budget deficit. I think it's pretty apparent at the local level, our local communities are facing budget crises as well. And when we talk about the state's budget deficit, I think it has been fundamentally clear, not just in the past couple of weeks, but in the past couple of months and even before that throughout the election, that we were going to have to make fundamental changes when it came to the relationship between state and local government in order to balance that budget. You just can't do it. When so much of the state's budget goes to aid to local government, you cannot balance the budget without changing that relationship. That's not unlike nearly every other state across the country. I've mentioned this before, but states like New York and California, Texas and Florida and others are cutting billions of dollars from their state aid to schools, to local governments, to the university systems and others. The difference here is what we're trying to achieve through this measure is giving those local governments the tools that they need to balance those budgets. So I mentioned yesterday the total amount of savings over the next 2 years of the state budget that this bill would provide, the changes in this bill would provide the local governments of this state is $1.44 billion, nearly $1.5 billion worth of savings. That is more than the reductions in state aid to local governments that will appear in my budget next week. Again, that's worth repeating. The savings that will materialize because of passage of this budget repair bill exceed the amount of reductions in state aid to local governments across the board. That's an important thing to remember. And so what I mentioned to this guy And I can understand his concern and his anxiety and his interest in moving this state forward. I want to move the state forward. I want to get back to the days we saw in the first weeks in office where we had measures that got this state working again, where Democrats joined us in voting along with Republicans to show that Wisconsin was indeed open for business. We need to do that again. But along the way, we can't just for a moment sacrifice the fact that we ultimately have to balance the budget. And what we've seen is that actions speak louder than words, that those that may have promised, at least one or two union leaders may have promised a 5 and a 12%, the actions of their local affiliate unions have shown in the past couple of weeks that they have no interest in actually moving forward on that. If they did, they would put their money where their mouth is and they'd offer up contracts that provide a 5 and a 12% contribution for pension and health care. The other thing I told this guy was simply put, we have got to balance this budget long term. You see, it's not just about now, it's about the future. And I, for one, don't want to pass this problem on to my children. I don't want to pass that on to anybody else's children in this state. This is a mess we inherited with $3.6 billion when it comes to this budget deficit, and it's not fair to pass it on to the next generation. That's what got us in this trouble in the first place. The fact that year after year, election after election, politicians in this Capitol of both political parties stood up and passed the buck on to the next budget cycle is precisely why we're in this trouble today, and it's about time that stopped and we ensure we make a commitment to the future. Now, let me be clear. This bill is not about me. This bill is about the hardworking taxpayers of Wisconsin. The people that I have seen over the past couple years since the economic meltdown have had to make sacrifices. But they've made those sacrifices in many cases to ensure that their coworkers in areas outside of government have not had to be laid off and to minimize the impact on other families in this state. It's not about the union bosses, the government union bosses that have come in from Washington and other parts about the country. It's ultimately not only about the taxpayers, it's about the workers as well. Workers who, as I read emails and listen to comments, I got to tell you, I understand, are scared. They're frightened. They're concerned. In fact, the more they hear about this, the more I think they're concerned because they're trying to figure out, most of them, in fact, who have been at work the last couple of weeks, who haven't been here protesting, but most who more than anything want to do the job they went into in the first place. They want to teach our children. They want to go to places like I used to be at the county where they want to serve county citizens or local citizens at the city or town or other community levels. They just want to do the job that they got into in the first place, and they're scared. They're scared because they don't know what their future holds and what will happen in their workplace. Now, we've tried to point it out time and time again that for our state employees, as an example, they have the strongest civil service protection in the country. That started back in 1905. That's not going to change in this bill. Those protections still remain. Things like merit hiring, just cause when it comes to termination or any sort of discipline, those things remain long after this bill passes. And we actually listened to people last week when they testified in one of the longest hearings ever and said that on the local level, teachers and city and county and other workers were concerned that somehow those same protections wouldn't be in place for them. And so we worked with lawmakers after that hearing and actually amended the bill to make sure there was a grievance process in place for teachers and city and county and other local workers as well to make sure they had those same sorts of protections. That's what this is about, is to make sure that ultimately it's not the union bosses coming in from other parts of the country. It's about making sure we not only protect the taxpayers, but we protect the workers. And probably the most important ways we protect the workers are making sure we go ahead with this bill and this measure and this plan as opposed to the alternative. Now, we've seen the alternative. I've talked about it before now, the fact that in this measure for this fiscal year alone through June 30th, our savings are the equivalent of 1,500 positions. Our savings in the next budget are the equivalent of 5,000 to 6,000 positions at the state level and another 5,000 to 6,000 at the local level as well. Now, when I was a county executive, I got to tell you, some of you covered me back then, one of the toughest decisions I ever had to make was the possibility of laying people off. It's why we worked so hard to try and find alternatives, whether it was in pension or health care. Heck, even for years, we tried to pull at one point even having a 35-hour work week once a month. Because for me, I'd do almost anything to avoid having to lay someone off because I knew that wasn't just a worker, that was somebody's family. That had a real impact. What we're trying to do here is avoid layoffs not only of state workers, but to avoid layoffs in our schools, in our cities, in our towns, in our counties, because that's ultimately what it's about. It's about protecting those workers who I think by and large, and I used to hear this at the county as well, when they'd come streaming to our office and they'd say, hey, we'd gladly take a 35-hour work week. I tell them, you got to go talk to your union because under collective bargaining, I can't mandate that. That's just got to happen. That's got to be something you've got to negotiate. Well, it didn't happen. And so instead we had furloughs and we had layoffs and we had other things that I just don't think are acceptable, not only to the public, but to so many of our workers. Now we're seeing the same thing here in the state of Wisconsin. We need to avoid those layoffs for the good of those workers and for the good of the people who provide services that are so vitally important here in the state of Wisconsin. We also need to give those workers the right to choose, to make sure they have a choice, that they have the right to choose what happens with those union dues, up to $1,000 in some cases, that they should have the right to say if instead they'd like to use that to pay for part of their health care and their pension contribution, they should have the right to do just that. But most of all, let me just end with this and then I'll open up some questions. What this is about, more than anything, is not about the present. It's not just about the remainder of this fiscal year's budget. It's not about the next 2-year budget. It's ultimately about the future. It's about whether or not we're willing to make a commitment to the future so that our children and their children don't face the dire consequences that we've inherited today. Again, that's what it's really all about. That's why we've got to change the circumstances in the state. We've got to balance this budget and do it in a way that is responsible so we don't have to 2, 4, 6 years down the road keep coming back and having these same challenges. With that, I'll entertain some questions.
You talked about, in that phone call yesterday, what we heard you talk about standing firm. You talked about you're not someone who's going to change your position. Is there any way you would talk about negotiating changes in this bill, or does this bill have to pass the way it is? And how long are you prepared to wait? If the senators want to stay in Illinois for weeks, months, are you prepared to wait that long?
Well, again, I'm an optimist, and I believe overwhelmingly the way to resolve this is the state assembly, the Democrats and Republicans alike, are here in the Capitol. They're debating the bill. Again, they've had some of the longest debate we've ever had. The state Senate is ready to go. I would hope, and again, I'm an optimist, but I would hope at some point there's enough pressure, even from people who may not have a strong opinion, although I don't know that there are many left in this state, but a strong opinion one way or the other on the bill would at least, I got to believe, overwhelmingly, the people of this state, no matter where they stand, for, against, or somewhere in between on this bill, believe that these 14 state senators belong in the state capitol, having the courage of their convictions to do their job. And I'm not going to do hypotheticals because I'm still holding out hope that if not all 14, at least some of those state senators will see the wisdom of coming home, because again, it's not just about the changes I'm talking about. It's about $165 million in debt restructuring savings, and the fact that if we don't have that, that causes all sorts of other problems. It's about the fact that, come the middle of May, the Medicaid program, which by statute requires us to move funds from one source to another to make up for the Medicaid gap that was there from the last budget, suddenly you start having IOUs for Medicaid providers. There's all sorts of other unintended consequences, and it's still my belief that in the end they'll come home. For us, I'm willing to listen. I looked at the stuff that the Assembly Democrats sent over today. Frankly, it was very similar to what Representative Peter Bark, the Democrat leader in the Assembly, and what State Senator Mark Miller, the Democrat leader in the Senate, raised to me as concerns 2 weeks ago when I briefed them behind these doors in the governor's office about what was exactly in this bill before I introduced it. So these aren't new things out there. For us, I'd love to find another way to move this forward. The biggest thing I would love, besides passing this, is finding a way to ensure every worker, every teacher, every city worker, every state worker out there, that we understand that they're afraid here, that we understand that there's a lot of uncertainty, a lot of concern out there, and we feel passionate about that because these are good, decent, hardworking people. I have respect for them. But in the end, to keep from having to have some of their colleagues laid off, to keep from having to make much more dire choices in the future, I believe this is what we have to pass. Sir, back here.
Do you think you were wrong to agree with the caller who labeled David Axelrod a son of a bitch and to take no issue with him when he urged you to crush the bastards?
No, in my case, I point out that we ruled that out. I said we get comments all the time. We get no at the very end of that when he talked about inciting things or things of that nature, we point out that was something. We get ideas all the time from people all across the state, and the bottom line is for us, we want to continue to have a civil debate about this. We want to have a good discussion about this. And the fact that he suggested something otherwise, we acknowledge that some had brought that up, but that we didn't think that was a good idea. Sure.
Are you concerned that as this game of chicken continues, that you may lose some of your Senate Republicans, 3 of them, and then be on the opposite end of this?
No, again, I think in the end, having talked to lawmakers repeatedly, time and time again, is the fact that I think they realize, having talked to their constituents, there's a lot of passion out there, and people are very respectful of that. I have a lot of lawmakers in both the Senate and the Assembly who've gone back to their districts, who've had meetings, who've had discussions, who've talked to folks out there. So they've gotten very strong opinions, both in favor of this measure and against this measure. But in the end, what they understand is less than a week from now, I'm going to be in front of the members of the state legislature introducing our biennial budget for the next 2 years. And I think they understand very fundamentally that we're going to have more than $1 billion of reductions in aid to local governments. And the only way to ensure that that doesn't negatively impact our schools and our cities and our towns and our villages is to make sure they have the tools to counteract that. And they do in this bill, almost $1.5 billion worth of savings to offset over $1 billion worth of reductions. That's incredibly important. So it's not, for a lot of folks, they think it's an either-or proposition. It's not. It's one of those where if you don't do this, the budget hole is still there. We don't have a way to balance the budget that doesn't push more of a burden on the taxpayers of the state in a way that would cripple our state's economy, and that doesn't work. So ultimately, we've got to do it in a way that not only solves this budget, but as I've said time and time again, I've got 2 high school sons. I'm not going to allow this situation to pass on an even bigger burden to them. The days of passing the buck on from one budget to the next, from one generation to the next, stop, and they stop now.
How late, what's the last possible day this can be passed in order for the debt restructuring to go through?
Well, we've looked at it, whether it was the end of the weekend or even as early as next week, beginning of next week. What we're going to do with both these things is when I talk about the debt restructuring, we want to push it as far as we can go reasonably to be able to technically do it. So we're not setting an arbitrary deadline. We've talked about it realistically. It should be done by this weekend, but if we could squeeze another day or 2 in, we try and do that. Because, again, I want to give as much time and much opportunity for those 14 state senators to be here. In the same regard, you know, there's a lot of talk and speculation about layoffs. Believe me, again, having done that before as the CEO at the county level, I got to tell you, that's one of the most painful, most difficult decisions, I should say, discussions as well, that I've ever had to make, because I know it affects real people. And so I'm going to take as long as possible to try and get to a point where we can resolve this situation, we can pass this measure, we can provide the kind of long-term relief so that both the state and our local governments can avoid having to make those tough decisions about layoffs.
Why not,
Sure, sure.
why not wait, why not pass the bill, leave out the collective bargaining, a lot of people suggest this, including your former opponent, Mayor Tom Barrett, and then just bring the collective bargaining back. You're not going to lose the majorities anytime soon.
Because it's all interconnected. As we've seen, and as I just mentioned, you know, the thought of the 5 and the 12% just doesn't work without collective bargaining. It's all tied into the budget. If you don't make these changes, unfortunately, the local unions have showed us all across the state that in the 2 weeks since I've introduced this bill, they have no interest of actually setting for those things. And all it does is it's going to expose local governments. So the better deal is to move forward on this. It's all about, collective bargaining does have a fiscal impact. Collective bargaining has a fiscal impact. Protecting, providing worker protections is something you can do outside of collective bargaining, and we have done for more than 100 years back here. Back there?
One more question.
Back there?
Governor, you said that it's imperative to have this bill done before you introduce your budget.
Mhm.
Will you introduce your budget next Tuesday regardless of whether or not this bill is passed? And will it help people to pass this bill if they actually see your budget?
Well, again, I'm an optimist, and I'm hoping we'll have this resolved by Tuesday. So I certainly hope, because, again, I think people need to see that one is connected to the other. It's why yesterday we laid out the fact that local governments will save $1.44 billion, nearly $1.5 billion, because of the changes that are proposed in this measure, on top of the $300 million the state of Wisconsin itself will save in this measure. Those items are paramount, because when the budget comes out, people are going to see the size of the reduction in state aid. But again, unlike other states across the country, they're going to see that there's some savings there. But this is by far not the only thing we're doing. There are going to be other reforms and changes that are going to be done to balance this budget. But again, it is imperative that we cannot pass the budget bill unless we have these changes in. You can introduce it, but you cannot pass it unless you're going to completely devastate local governments and force thousands of unneeded layoffs across the state. The best way to resolve this, the best way to avoid those layoffs, is for people to encourage those 14 state senators, and they don't have to vote for it, they don't have to agree for it, but they should do what the Assembly Democrats have done for the last several days, and that is come back to the Capitol and make their case. Thanks very much.